What's up, guys? Steven here today. And today, what I wanted to talk to you about is the five motherfucking bodies. And what am I talking about? Well, you probably have heard this over and over and over and over and over and over already, right? You have a physical body, you have mental, emotional, blah, 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 right? Some people go beyond this range. Certain people shorten the range. Certain people fucking warp the range. But I wanted to, I guess, formally define the fucking range, define the fucking spectrum, and then literally break down each part of the spectrum, how it affects you, or how that, or the primary, you could say, specialty of that particular spectrum or component, and then also how to take care of it, right? Because that's something a lot of people don't talk about. They just say, oh, you have this shit, but they don't tell you how to cultivate it, optimize it for growth, to where it's self-sustainable, to where it stays healthy, geared for longevity, the long game, fucking set up for swag win, which is a swag foundation, right? So let's get into it. I personally believe, and these are my thoughts and my opinions, right? From my experiences. So feel free to agree, disagree. Really don't give a fuck. As always, just dropping some fucking value, hoping it helps you in one way or the other. I believe that there are essentially 5 bodies, and I use the spelling Bodiis, right? It's kind of done on purpose. You can Google it, and hopefully you'll latch on to the thread that reveals its importance. But essentially, there are 5 bodies, and I believe that in fucking going from most easily accessible to least easily accessible, in the sense that it's most palpable to least palpable. That's another way of putting it. Or most easily to be cognizant of or become aware of through the 5 senses, right? So I'm not talking about the higher senses, but just the 5 basic, or the basic senses, right? Sight, touch, smell, hearing, and taste, right? And so from that range, or from basically from that, right? From least palpable, from most palpable to least palpable, or most easily to be cognizant of, to least easy to be cognizant of. You have your physical body, your mental body, your emotional body, and I put a slash here, Auric Bodii, which is actually believe it's one and the same. I'll go into it. Your Astral Bodii and your Aetheric Bodii, right? So let's break this down. Your physical body is essentially your vessel, right? It's obviously the one everyone is most familiar with, because you, on some level, interact with it in the how can I say it? In the material sense, most often than all the other bodies, and pretty much every day, right? You touch yourself, right? You lick yourself, you wet yourself, etc. You feel yourself, or you feel the texture of self, right? Like you can rub your hand through the veins of your hand or your cack, or your abs, right? And you can feel the physical body. It is literally the shell that holds every, or it's, you can say it's like the foundation upon which all the other bodies are comprised or contained in, right? Think of like a Russian doll, right? The outermost doll is like the biggest doll of them all, right? But in this sense, it's not necessarily that this body is the biggest or even the most impactful. It is just that it's the most easy to access one, right? And so by that virtue, it's the one that contains all the other, right? Because for something to grow less easy to be accessed, it has to, by definition, be less reachable, if you will, than this physical body, right? You can think of like proof by induction here, right? So that's kind of how we define it. And obviously, as I mentioned, it's like a vessel, or if you want to get poetic with it, it's the teacup that holds the water, right? As such, um, it is most optimized or most cultivated when one places emphasis on what I call the swag minerals, right? Like zinc, calcium, iron, right? Vitamin D, right? Vitamin E, B12s, right? Just those, pretty much your rocks, right? Because this body is literally made of those rocks, right? And with like just by the fine-tuned ratio of rock to like solute, or just say it's called water, right? Salt to water, there is like an ebb and flow where like um, at certain times due to temperature the salt will solidify and it will become solid, right? And then at other times it will actually break it down and it will become wet, right? So it'll become salt water, right? So this is literally, on some level, you can think of like your organs, right? Um, your intestines, your bones, right? Think of like what bone marrow is, right? Um, this is literally also like blood itself, right? Like, have you ever tasted your blood? It has like a weird, like metallic taste to it. Um, this is also obviously um, the waste itself, right? Like when you poo and you pee, on some level, you can think of it as like just a composition of salt to water, right? And then obviously with different factors into play, chemicals, blah blah blah, it shifts or it skirts more towards like a basic solution than like rather acidic, right? So it's just like this ebb and flow. But if you think about it, it's all about just the stones, those swag minerals. So that's how you cultivate and you take care of that physical body. Just ensure that you're always you're constantly intaking those minerals, right? And this is the old cliche, old adages: eat salads, right? Eat fruit. An apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? Like this is like have a bowl of fruit with every meal, right? This is the whole like drink like your at least a gallon if you can, or at least 5 liters of water every day, right? That's literally where that comes from. So that's the physical body, right? And that's how you optimize it and you cultivate, you take care of it. And essentially by doing that, you're ensuring that, as I mentioned, this ebb and flow, this tandem between solidification, if you will, and waterification stays fluid, right? There's no blockage. Um, Something to consider: cancer is essentially when not only, I mentioned this before, right? One way of thinking about it is like it's like there is uh, there's like there's a kink in the hose, right? You have a hose, you open the fucking valve, water goes through the hose, and then you just say you bend the hose, and all of a sudden it goes, right? Kind of like when someone is fucking cucking you. Giving you blue balls. You're about to come? Nope! Nope! That's pretty much what it is, right? That's one way of thinking about it. Because due to that blockage now, circulation has fluid everywhere, right? There is not a, what you call like, equal distribution of fluids, right? Fucking fluid mechanics bros can like chime in here. But then now there's like tension, there's a buildup at like places, and they always tend to be key places, right? So I've mentioned like the area right above or right where your pubes are, right? Like right above where the tunnel where pee comes out, right? That's one place, right? There, the area right at the end of the intestines is another, right? The area, I don't want to say your heart. I don't want to say the conjoining of like the what do you call it? They use the term like action impulses, right? So like your heart works on like essentially like an irregularity, right? So one, there's like an off kilter essentially, and then that's what creates the pulse, right? So I don't want to say that's one of the points, but I'd like to say that like, so if you look at the heart as it is, it's essentially like two halves, right? And then essentially the parts that hold the halves, like look at my hands, right? That's another place where buildup tends to occur, right? So if you notice, for example, people with lung cancer, they tend to have, if you put your hand on their hearts or whatever, you'll notice that like one half of the heart will, you will feel that tension. It will have like a blockage compared to the other part, right? So that's another one, right? Other people have like genetic predispositions, maybe just the fact that like go from like a long line of smokers causes them to have like really soft throats, right? So I think is the word esophagus. Yeah, the esophagus. Wait. Yeah, the esophagus. But yeah. So here's your throat, right? There's like a point right there, right where like the fucking you can actually see that indenture like right there, because it curves. Essentially, it does this thing, and people tend to have like blockages there, right? So there's all these key points. Eastern philosophy goes in depth into it, describing it in terms of like routes, meridians, etc. But essentially, it's aware to be. It's nice to be aware of the body as a system from that point of view, and to, I guess, self-assess, and then realize that de-stressing or unkinking the hose at those particular points is the key to removing these blockages, right? Some people like to focus on diet. They say that if you change your composition of maybe like, fats to carbs, right? So by eating more carbs, you're essentially introducing what, for lack of better words, are like sponge agents or you can say, think of like molecules that act like sponges and essentially remove these particular blockage inducing compounds, right? So they attack it from like a chemical point of view, right? Think of, I guess, out there as a way to latch onto the thread, like think of what a lipoprotein is, right? Think of like what white blood cells are, right? Just things are literally made to target like toxins, right? So if you eat higher concentration of the building blocks for these eight, I guess, chemicals or agents, whatever you want to call them, then you have a higher likelihood that your body produces them, which will then increase the likelihood of them concentrating at these points of blockages and alleviating or essentially doing the work of like de-stressing it, right? So that's a chemical way of approaching it. Others, my personal, is like just swag fucking massage, running, working out, right? And just gaining a deeper understanding of like how anatomy, biomechanics works. Like really like solid like massage therapy techniques, like structural integrity, rolfing, and then just understanding how to apply it at key parts where the area that you're targeting is essentially subcutaneous. So what I'm saying is like it's below the surface of the body, right? So there's like a particular way of like you have to essentially like Kamehameha, key blast that shit out of there, right? That's another way of approaching it, right? But my point is, that's those are some of the things you should think about and you should consider in ensuring that you're cultivating this physical body and doing your best or your part to make sure that it runs at like optimum level, right? I feel like there's something else I wanted to add to this. It'll probably come to me. I'll just say, watch some of the older videos on this, where I talk about like the 4 elements of the body, cultivating your speech, just those, I guess I'll call them classic videos, or some of like the first videos of this particular series. Probably just give you more of an in-depth idea of what you can do to help your physical body, right? So that's that. Now moving on, you have the mental body, right? And the mental body, I like to essentially, or to give a multi-dimensional visual representation of what it looks like. It's more fluid than the physical body, in the sense that you could just represent it by, when you have an iPhone and someone is texting, you see those 3 dots. That's literally what the mental body is, right? That ability to, that higher cognitive ability to be able to see the chain or sequencing of events. That is, at its root essence, what it is, right? Because if you think about it, like, if you think about just the fact, like, what it means to observe time, right? Time is like, it's this, obviously you can get really philosophical here and be like, well, yeah, it's like this human construct designed to help us essentially not only manage our, or to help us increase our likelihood of acquiring natural resources. So, right, like, just going back to like basic just fucking hunting and understand, okay, the goat comes out at 4, or like when the sun is like there, so I should probably go to that area at that time, not before, right? Or something as simple as like the fucking herb that you chew that like induces all these magical properties only grows or sprouts or is seen every like 4 moons, right? So every time I count the moon 1, I see the moon, occurrence of the moon. I see another, second occurrence. I see third occurrence, fourth occurrence. After that fourth occurrence, I see that fucking magic herb. So that means that I should only look for it every fourth occurrence. Like shit like that, right? If you think of it like that, then you realize why time is there, or how the idea of time came into play, right? But my point is, in being able to become cognizant of the unique or distinct moments in and of time, that in of itself is a gift, right? Because I mean, you can have senses, you can have eyes, but then to actually like process what your eyes are seeing in a way that is advantageous to you, in a way that is increasing the likelihood of something that you desire to occur, that is a gift and game-changing ability in and of itself. And if you think about it, that's essentially what you're doing with your thoughts, right? When you formulate a thought, you're essentially sequencing a particular moment in time, and you're using symbols to represent what that moment in time essentially would look like, right? Like it's almost like you're creating that moment in time before it occurs, right? That's why like a lot of like these like I guess you could say esoteric or religions even like really stress the importance of your thoughts, right? Like Buddhism talks about like what thoughts become ideas, become thoughts, thoughts become beliefs, beliefs become words, words become actions, actions become who you are, right? And then who you are changes the world, right? So it's like just what you formulate is essentially what is going to occur. And what I'm trying to say is that, like, for example, this moment, right? I'll use the word, you know how frame per second, right? Right, video editing bros. This is one frame. This is another frame. This is another frame. This is another frame, right? Every moment in time is its own unique frame. And the ability to not only perceive it, but to foretell when a particular frame or a particular desired frame will come about is the goal of the mental body, right? And so it does that by your thoughts, and through your thoughts, through the words, you essentially go to it. The words essentially, you can say, creates like the end point, right? And by essentially thinking about these thoughts, as I call, adding more energy to it or energizing it, what happens is now you're essentially piecing together the logical sequence of events that will occur before the desired frame or moment in time occurs, right? So the more you think about something, the more you essentially, it's like your cognitive abilities are essentially coming up with the, if you want, 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, or with the required power series necessary to get to that particular value, right? That particular effort, F of T, right? Or F of T is like the desired moment, right? And F is like the function of fucking time, right? Just you living your life. At like moment 9, this is what you want. And to get to moment 9, these are the values before. So by knowing the values before, you will know that, oh, just like after that fourth occurrence, boom, there's what I want, right? So I hope that was fucking crystal clear and baller as fuck, because I was kind of scared. I was thinking about how to talk about that, because it's one of those concepts that can easily become really ephemeral. I'm just really glad how it came out now. I hope it was valuable to you. So essentially, how do you go about optimizing and cultivating this mental body? Well, obviously, it's kind of funny how, again, because the vessel contains all the other bodies, how well that physical body will work will most likely help increase the likelihood of the mental and the upper bodies running at optimum level, right? So that's one already. And then number 2, for the mental body itself, they're actually if you want to, so one approach or one way of thinking about it is like the chemical again, right? So obviously minerals, right? Just eating well will ensure that your body creates niacin, riboflavin, right? And I think it's B6. Pretty much the shit you'd get from eating eggs, right? And the reason why is because a lot of those chemicals, particularly tying to neurotransmitter activity, and for the sake of the logical framework of the conversation, and for swag or really crystal clear understanding, I'll define neurotransmitters as simply in the way that the mental body pieces together time or sequence of events. Neurotransmitter is essentially their physical manifestation of that particular activity within the body itself. Another way of putting it is every time you have a thought, it actually leaves a physical imprint. Like there's proof that you had that thought on your body itself, right? And this proof is a neurotransmitter, right? It's literally as if a road was created, and why they look like lanes, right? Because you're literally piecing together objects in time, if you will. Like if we can say that moments in time are objects, right? Nodes, if you want. And like time, space, there is no absolute center, right? So say like you're a fucking astronaut or whatever, like you're in space, there's really no north or north-south. So like direction is relative to you, right? That's pretty much how they always do it. So now essentially when you think of a thought, you're piecing together a particular object in space to you, right? And then, for example, to get to the end point, you're piecing together you to the object. And in that piecing together, that path ties together the necessary sequence of events that need to occur for you to essentially reach that moment in time or desired frame, right? And that's essentially where you open the fucking Pandora's box and swag gateway with like There are infinite, endless possibilities. There are many ways to skin a cat. Anything is possible, right? It's like, um, here's A, here's B. This path is the same amount of work as this path, and that's the same amount of work as that path, or as that path, right? Because work is a scalar value, meaning that at the end of the day, there's an absolute quantity to represent going from A to B. And if you think about it, it's fucking beautiful how that is. How, like, even in, like, that fucking void of, like, non-true north possessing environment, the universal concept of measure, right? Like, the ruler, like, God's ruler, like, is always present, meaning you can always say here and there. And by that definition, there is always a value attributed to that, right? Regardless of the shape that it takes. So, like, that's essentially my spiel. Like, okay, you can have this sequence or that sequence or that sequence, right? And so, all of those possibilities are unique pathways, right? And each of those pathways leave their own imprint, like proof that they were in fact created or conceived in mind by the formation of a neurotransmitter. Right? You can think of it as like literally your brain thinking differently. Just say that phrase again. Thinking differently. Slowly, 5 times. You start like that. That's fucking awesome. Right? So, chemicals or foods that like enhance neurotransmitters, I mentioned eggs, right? Just make sure you're getting your niacin. Obviously, if you're into like, I guess, new age shit, like you will know like the third eye and what's the fucking thing? What is the chemical behind the third eye? Pineal gland, yeah. Your pineal gland, right? You can do some research in that. Funny enough, it's like tied to, it's composed of calcium and magnesium and ammonium, so yeah, and phosphate. So yeah, like it's essentially proteins, right? So, which is essentially what you get from eggs. Boom. So that's one way of going about it, right? Another way, and my swag way, is just obviously a workout. I believe everything can be worked out, right? So the workout for building your mental is meditation, right? And I talked at length about it in a previous video, cultivating your life force, cultivating your spiritual foundation, like how to go about it, define what it actually is, right? How it's actually a lot simpler than what most people think, and the benefits that you gain from it. And it is simply just the 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 conscious the conscious desire of essentially tracking your focus, or keeping your focus on a point that is constant, right? So it's not moving, like you're staring at this one thing in time, causes your mind to become aware of the, if you want, for lack of better words, millisecond changes, the millisecond details, right? Or another way of saying it, the changes that occur from dt when dt is equal to like 1 millisecond, right? So it's like, even though it's so small, like there's little to no change. Just the fact that like the earth is constantly moving, and you're on the earth. So even though you're still moving a little bit, just that little slight movement causes change, right? And through meditation, you will actually become aware, like um, minutely aware of just those micro details. Like, oh wow, like first the point was here, and now I'm like here, and so now it's offset this way. Now I'm like here, so it's offset that way, right? You just like it forces you to just pay attention to the details, and that's crucial, right? Because when you sequence events together to the desired outcome, those details become crucial, right? Because sometimes like the desired frame might look really similar to, um, I guess you could say like a previous, a subsequent or previous um, pointless frame, like a frame that really, a moment in time that didn't really have anything of value or anything particular to it. But since, because of like your eye had like that like hyper focus, it was almost like your eye had like a magnification, like 100x or 1000x, and so it just perceived details that you would not have caught on to had you not been that hyper focused or paying attention, right? So that's a really, really powerful way of cultivating your mental body and ensuring that it's always working the way that it should, right? Another one, so people in the past would, this is where the whole doing puzzles, right, come in and play, because it's not so much the um, it's not so much the the sound exercise of like logic and reason, but it's actually just the um, activation of your perceptual senses, right? So like, okay, you know that at some point this picture needs to be, right? This is what I have of the picture. This piece looks like it might fit here. Oh, it doesn't. Oh, if I tilt it that way, it does, right? And so now you have this. And then here's another one. Okay, well, oh, compare it. Oh, it looks like that piece, right? So that perceptual sense is actually keen, because on some level it's kind of tied to realizing on a clearer level what that desired moment in time or what that desired frame looks like, right? To the level, like to an nth degree, like the degree to where like you can perceive as if um, every pixel, if you will, of that frame is detachable and it's unique, and you can literally um, perceive the uniqueness of each pixel. Kind of like God knows everyone by their name. He knows you. He knows. He calls you by his name. He calls you by your name because he knows you. It's kind of like that, right? So you just perceive every single thing and you know exactly its place. So that's another way. But I say that in today's age, the equivalent of that, as funny as it sounds, is actually swimming. And it sounds so weird, but I don't know, like, I think there is some super, not, what's the word? It's like, there is some super physiological benefits to swimming that we have not uncovered yet, and specifically tying to just how your visual acuity is actually different when you're in water than when you're in the ground, right? I kind of don't want to say too much about it because I feel like my words would just get jumbled up. But swimming is actually another great way of cultivating your mental body, because inside the water you will perceive um, things visually differently than when you're just on ground, right? You can tie this to fucking, what they call it? The C is wave in free space. What is the word I'm thinking of? What is the word? What is the constant name? Is it the dielectric? So, yeah, dielectric constant. Oh, dude, yeah. Yeah, the dielectric constant is different in water than it is in fucking air. So that's why. Check that out. Kind of exhausted that mental body. So I hope you got something from that. And so now we shall move on to the next. And it is the Emotional Bodii. And emotional / Auric, as I mentioned, right? And that's also, it would also be another, I guess, for a multi-dimensional visual representation of the emotional body. I always use fucking Dragon Ball Z, like the thing around them, right? And the reason being is because the emotional body is essentially tied to your overall physiological frequency, if you can think of it in that way. Like, if you can think of like the physiology itself, not just like, I'm not just talking about your mental, I'm not just talking about your physical body, like how hot, like the temperature, if they're, you know, like people, they like to do topological maths, like, oh, the head is really hot here and really cold there. But I'm talking about, like, if you could translate the sum of all that shit into, like, an actual, like, value, like, a value in time, right? A value that's a measure of time, like how, I mean, I want to use the word oscillation, but I feel like it's lazy. So it's like, I guess you can say how, like, if, imagine that the start of the body is the start of a signal, right? So you know how, like, your brain emits signals, right? And so the start of the body is the start of a signal, and then imagine that there is a loop, a circuit that runs across the entire body and then comes back to the brain, right? It would be a function of that, like how fast, how many loops, I guess, per second, millisecond, whatever it is, you're currently emitting, right? And that would essentially be the representation of frequency for your physiology, which is kind of funny because it kind of conversely ties into brain waves, right? And it's really interesting because then you start realizing, like, holy shit, like, so that's why there are colors tied to them, right? Now, the reason why I tied emotional and auric is because a lot of people like to see them as two, but I feel like they're essentially one and the same, right? Because, so what are emotions, right? Let's break it down to, like, their fundamentals, right? And for the sake of a fruitful conversation and for for our logical framework, right? I will define emotions, or an emotion, as the ratio of dopamine to serotonin, right? I think that's the one, right? Did I say that right? I think I did. There, my English is really, really bad. Okay. Okay, right. So, what is dopamine? Everyone knows that dopamine is um, dopamine is essentially the feel-good chemical in the body, right? But what if essentially um, you didn't see it as the feel-good chemical? The reason why people say that is because they're actually looking or focused on the end result, so the effect. The effect of the activation of dopamine eventually results, or the end of that sequence of events results into like um, releases of chemicals that essentially um, uh, induces euphoria, right? So you feel good, right? But what I'm trying to say is dopamine is actually um, it's more of an activation chemical than the thing that makes you feel good. So how I would explain this is that imagine that um, your body, like every single part of your body, right? And we're gonna go super deep because this is what it's directly tied to, your bones, right? So we're talking about your skeleton, your skeletal body, right? Um, and it's kind of funny because I just realized that I kind of so I'd introduced this in the Cultivating Your Life Force Bones Density. All right, so check that out. But essentially, every bone of your body, imagine that it's like a piece of its own, like it's a component, right? Now, what happens is for them, for your bones to essentially stay together, there is, you can call it like a connector, like a connecting point, right? So the point between, so this, the hand is one unit, right? The fingers, etc. This is like one unit. But then for this unit to connect to this, right, which is like the wrist, which will essentially tie into the arm, right? There's a connecting unit here, hence like the protrusions, right? And essentially the thing that glues them together are, um, you could say, I mean, people use the word receptors, right? Um, essentially, it's like there's this small gap, right? But because of the small gap, kind of going back to just like a capacitor, right? Like the space between two plates, right, causes a magnetic field. In the same way, that's essentially what's happening between each or at each connecting scene between the different units, right? The different bone units. There's like a magnetic field that connects and it essentially glues them together, right? This is done through, obviously, there's chemicals that essentially induce um, or intensify this magnetic field or this electromagnetic effect, right? Characteristic. And one of them is dopamine. Right, so dopamine actually intensifies it, meaning, like, imagine you have your capacitor, and then, like, imagine someone, uh, what do you call it? How do you increase the force of the charge, right? I think that's how you would increase the field. Correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially, someone made the charge stronger, right? So that means now the field is way stronger. Like it's way harder to pull the plates apart. So that means that the magnetic field is that much more stronger. In the same way, increasing or dopamine essentially, you can say it releases sort of like a pulse, right? Like an electromagnetic pulse. You can literally think of like a thunderbolt, and this thunderbolt makes what is like literally gluing itself that much more stronger, right? So that's essentially how we're able to sustain like literally fucking life um, altering trauma at these connecting points and still come out fine. Like literally still just being able to be like, and then oh, let's go, right? Simply because it's just like that electromagnetic field gluing it together is that fucking strong, right? So not only does like the superficial, like the skin, right, um, does a good job of like maybe preventing the shock from penetrating, but in the case that the impact penetrated or I guess perforated the skin, right, going the whole um, punching through the wall instead of at the wall adage. Now you have the secondary layer, right? You have um, the fat, right? So you can think of like there's this fucking tissue, this bag full of feathers that's like right beneath the skin, right? That's why like when you if you ever get a burn, you see white, right? That's like fat, right? So that surrounds it, and then afterwards, within that bag, there's like this gel-like substance, right? That slows or absorbs the shock even more, right? So that's like the whole fucking myofascia bit, right? And then you get to like the muscles. Then you get into at the core, at the center, like deep within all that, you see the bone, right? So all of that essentially prevents like all those layers literally make it to where we can sustain that much shock and trauma and be okay, right? Without like not only even without like maybe one or two of those layers, just the strength of that electromagnetic field or strengthened by dopamine is enough to literally blow your mind and show you what you're fucking capable of sustaining, right? So another way of putting it, imagine like your body or your bones are like dots, right? So you've seen think of like whack-a-mole, right? So it's like all these holes, right? And then dopamine essentially, so the holes are black, and when dopamine is released, a hole turns white, right? You can think of it as like it becomes electromagnetic. So it increases the propensity of that area to essentially be like a connector, right? That's why like it's found quite commonly like in neurotransmitters, because when you're stitching shit together, a good way of like keeping everything um, of making sure that everything stays, of ensuring that the imprint stays, is by keeping it activated, right? So when it's essentially, so when a hole is lit, so to speak, it makes it to where you can say that area is live, right? So the electromagnetic field comes into play, right? And it makes connection that much more sound and secure, right? Now going back to the whole bit on like, imagine there's a signal, there's a circuit. Imagine that every time you completed a jump, right? So from here to like here, right? So we hit a connecting point here, right? These are two units. Imagine that now every time you successfully completed a connection or you successfully passed, I use the word jump, meaning like you actually went through the connecting bit and you went through 100%. So the signal was intact. Every single time that occurs, it's almost like your bone whistles, right? So you know how like your flute, if you just blow through it, it like produces a sound, right? Like a really beautiful frequency, a really nice harmonic tone, if you want to use the word. In the same way, every time you pass, you successfully complete a jump, your bone whistles because that act, because of the angle and all that, it actually creates a harmonic tone. And this harmonic tone is manifested in like the release of, I guess, for lack of better words, euphoria, right? Like your body is literally vibrating at the vibrating at the sounds of the harps of the angels. And so like you feel good because of that vibration, right? It's like a particular ding, right? Like the harmonious thing, right? So every single time you complete a successful jump, your body does a harmonious thing, right? And so that is what feels good, right? Because you're oscillating like a frequency that we're naturally supposed to be at all the time, right? And so that is essentially why we feel good. It's not necessarily because dopamine causes that, but it's because if dopamine is activated or is present, the likelihood of that occurring is higher. Now, that's pretty much how people related those two events, and they're not necessarily caused by one another, but and I hope that made sense. So that's how the good feeling occurs. Now, conversely, you also have another chemical called serotonin, and serotonin is essentially the chemical that counters dopamine, right? So if dopamine makes those a whack-a-mole hole turn on or lights it up, if dopamine makes it lit, then serotonin turns it off, like it shuts it down, right? And so now you see how like there's a tandem, right? Where literally like areas or cells, entire cells, can be literally seen as their ratio or composition of dopamine and serotonin, right? And these two, like that ratio can be like a great predictor of the health of that cell, right? If there's a higher concentration of serotonin, that means that most likely there will be parts of the cell that are inactivated. And thus, when the signal comes through, right, going back, or circulation, whatever, that cell there'll be parts where essentially the signal will not make the jump, right? And so now, kind of funny, but to break your balls a little bit for my electronics bros, what happens when a signal is like you have a circuit and you have a path and it's unable to propagate through a particular path. Like maybe there's an open, right? Like there's no path here. What does it do? The signal just finds the next available path, right? And that's the same thing that happens here. The cell, okay, maybe sector D1 is shut off, but sector D3, S1, and S2 is not. So it'll just go through there, right? And so, okay, it might be 3/4 activated, but that's still enough for a signal to pass through. Nevertheless, that still means that the cell is not at optimum, right? Because optimum is when they're all activated. So that's another way, or another representation, or another way you can see where your emotions come through, right? Because it's funny, that old adage, people say that motion creates emotion. And I literally just explained how and why, right? Like when you're able to go through a connecting point, right? Dopamine being there, you are, or the signal is in motion, and thus good emotion is produced because the vibration is induced, right? When it's not there, like as thus most likely presence of, or there's a higher concentration of serotonin, then most likely what will happen is that area will not be as lit, and thus the signal will not be in as free motion as it could be, and thus you will you'll more likely feel something. It's like emptiness, right? Like when you're empty inside, right? And that's what we typically attribute as a bad feeling. So good feelings and bad feelings, or good emotions or and bad emotions, and whatever label you want to attribute, whether it's happy, ecstatic, joyful, um, what's another one? Boisterous, to like depressed, anxious, melancholic, chagrined, right? Like the whole gamut. It's essentially just the ratio or the composition of these two chemicals, right? Just how live a particular sector or organ, or actually bone, right? Because remember, at the end, it's all about the bone. How lit is a bone? And then, if lit, then feel good. Else, if not all the way lit, then you'll feel a mix, right? And if you're not lit at all, you'll most likely feel bad. And that's another reason why just touching yourself feels incredible, like on all levels. Just like simply the act of doing this, right? Running your hand through your hair, like running your hand through the balls of your feet, or the butts of your hand, right? It feels incredible simply because you're inducing the activation of dopamine in that bone, right? Or in this particular sector of that bone, which essentially increases the likelihood that that may cause maybe motion to spur on, right? Like whole Newton, an object stays in motion unless acted upon by another force, right? So I do this, okay, now there's more force on that bone. So now, like, you have a higher likelihood of, okay, I kind of want to spread it through my hand. And so before you know it, you make the whole bone lit, right? And then that causes a whole fucking rejuvenation in of itself, and which causes like a sequence of favorable events to occur, right? So that's essentially how that works. And my biggest thing in saying all this is that it's crazy how something has like micro, has like just two chemicals and like one sector, right? Like the bottom left corner of like a particular, or of this bone, right? Can literally affect the fucking overall physiology, right? Or the frequency, like your frequency, physiological frequency, simply because, what is it? The sum of the parts is equal to the whole. whole is nothing without the parts. And so if one part is sad, the whole will feel it, right? And why essentially that ties into your aura, right? And a quick blurb about like I try not to. I was kind of hesitant to talk about your aura because um, people have kind of well, it's something that's very like esoteric, right? So it's always dealing with like you essentially have to like have like um, your higher senses to be able to really perceive it. But I always say if you can't see it, you can feel it because energy is energy, and your energy can always be felt. That's why like you don't have to say anything. I'll know whether or not you're honest or not. Like everyone, you can always feel where people are coming from, right? Just by virtue of like being life forms, right? And so the reason why I kind of shied away from it is because people like to tie it to colors, right? But you can't always see colors, right? So that's essentially why, actually, if you've been paying attention, I've been describing it in terms of a circuit because that's actually what it is, right? They use the word human energy field and how like there is this energy field that is like it extends from like maybe 3 inches to like beyond, depending on like your level of like spiritual, I guess, awareness or like IQ or your level, the level of like spiritual growth, right? And how some people can actually make it extend even way beyond, and how true that is, right? Like how like when someone of like great, like who's just like such a value to life itself, when he touches down somewhere, it's felt everywhere, right? Um, so that's essentially what that is. And if you think about it, it's just like the signal, right? Completing the circuit. But now imagine that like not only is this circuit so fluid, like it's occurring so fast, like the frequency, the physiological frequency is occurring so fast that it's almost like it creates its own electro, or I want to say bioenergetic properties. Um, and I'll use the word transcendental / mystical bioenergetic properties that can literally be recognized and felt and experienced by other people around them, right? Simply because it's kind of like the same way like a magnetic field, if you turn on the charge, becomes really, really powerful to the point like you can literally cut the tension with a butter knife. In the same way, their field is so strong, their aura or their emotional body is so strong, so cultivated, and it's so optimum that like literally just sucks you in, right? And so that's where people, you may have seen drawings of how you will see these like magnetic fields just emanating, right? And it's like concentric circles. So that's where that comes from. I hope that helped. Kind of talked about how to cultivate this body, right? So self-massage, obviously, motion, working out, eating well. Funny enough, making yourself laugh. Like, I don't know what it is, but there's something about the release. It's like the act of laughing, like the sequence of events that occur for you to actually move your excuse me the motor I guess you could say the motor functions that are involved in making this smile um, cause such a huge activation of dopamine centers across multiple areas of the body that it's actually such an easy um, zero effort, zero cost way of um, not only increasing your frequency but also increasing dopamine, right? So making yourself laugh, like doing things that are fun, right? That make you feel really, really good. Um, that's another one. Obviously, sex, right? Masturbation. um, there's a lot, right? I mean, you kind of know what makes you feel good. The only caveat that I'll say to this is just be mindful of what you do to make yourself feel good. Because again, your body, it's literally just remember that your bone is whistling, right? But it's whistling because of the connection, the successful jump of the signal, right? So, for example, you might be at a basketball game and you're like, yeah, right? And because signal, yeah, boom, right? It's like that succession and then all of like the successful jumps is what releases um, the activation or is what causes the activation of dopamine. Meaning it's the action that causes the activation of dopamine. It's not the event itself, right? And so that's kind of what I was trying to hint to because I mean, you can, if y'all into like anchoring and um, all that shit, right? I think I talked about this in like the nature of reality, like going into um, really defining your subjective reality, the power of labels, right? Talked about this in swag phonetics, right? Just how labels actually cause subconscious imbuing or anchoring of like positive feelings to negative feelings based on just that word's um, commonly um, used representation, right? So use a word and typically it's used to represent this, right? And because of that, because it's typically used to represent this, you subconsciously start creating pathways that essentially tie this to the word. So whatever feelings, whatever ratio of dopamine to serotonin this generates, you're going to anchor it to that word, right? So in the same way, whatever um, ratio of dopamine to serotonin a particular action generates, you're going to anchor it to that action, right? So sometimes you might be doing something bad, but because it feels good, you don't realize it, right? So that's just kind of my thing. Just kind of be aware. Um, just smart to be aware. So yeah, that's that. So working out, making yourself laugh. Obviously, chemically, drugs. Drugs are a huge release of dopamine. Not because of the chemical itself, but because typically uh, I guess, um, the way the drug is added to your system. So you're smoking it, or you're snorting it, or you're in swallowing it, right? Whatever. the fact that it's added to your system means that it's going through a particular fucking channel, right? Which means that it's actually going through a part of that whole circuit, right? That your signal is going through. So at one point, your signal is going to run into it and then add to it whatever that it's bringing and actually just spread it across the entire body. And that's what makes it drugs so easy. Or that's what makes the release of like dopamine and that shit so easy when using drugs, because it's just spreading shit. It's not so much the fact that it's the drug itself. It's kind of like, okay, you know, you have a circuit. Okay, if you have a gas that, like, by virtue of it being a gas, it's going to go everywhere. Well, then, and you also know that anytime something goes somewhere, it activates something. It activates dopamine. Well, then, by virtue of that, that gas is going to activate dopamine everywhere and cause like a huge release of dopamine. So that's essentially why drugs are such an easy way to feel good. But and caution on that, obviously. Foods, well, I think just the act of eating itself. They're I think they're. Let's see. Sugars, right? Because of the carbon, right? If you go back, so dopamine is the activation of a connecting point, right? Some people call it receptor, right? And receptors are built through what? Carbs, right? They have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, slightly negative charge. Yep, slightly oxygen, usually a hydrogen oxygen atom ratio of 2 to 1, right? And so I think typically they tend to be negatively charged. And so that's essentially what causes that. And why eating them feels so good. Just be careful, obviously. It's very much why sugar is sweet tasting, right? And we attribute sweet to a pleasant feeling because of the activation of dopamine all along, since carbs are huge part of the receptor sites, right, or the connecting sites. So if you put in a whole bunch of the building blocks that make these receptor sites, obviously they're going to light up, right? The food particularly, I don't know, man. I just kind of just said it. So, so that's food. It's for a healthy way of working out, and then obviously lifestyle way, making yourself laugh, do that kind of stuff. Yeah, I talked about this in Bone Destiny. It's a bone that ecosystem of positive emotions, as Auric D. Tyler would put it. So that's that. On to the next body. This is where it gets a little woozy. Hope you're still with me. And now, the next body is the Astral Bodii. And the reason why it gets woozy is because even to this day, I feel like I have a weird or hard time explaining this. A lot of people essentially tie the Astral Bodii to the soul, right? Because often it's been depicted as the thing that, you know, that scene where the guy is sleeping and then he's like, oh, realize he's woken up in his sleep, but he's woken up. His physical body is paralyzed, but his astral body isn't. And then all of a sudden he gets up or he leaves his body, and then he's just kind of like flying through the air, through space, like a ghost, right? And while he still has the umbilical cord that ties him to his body, he won't die, right? And that's an interesting way of putting it. And I guess I would say that's right, but I would add to it by saying that, and this is where it kind of gets a little tricky, because I want to say that the astral body is actually the body that's tied to imagination and future projection, right? So what this means is when you're making plans for the future, on some level, you're also essentially believing that you have a future, right? Meaning that, as opposed to someone who is completely depressed and completely anxious and feels like death is imminent, which I can say because I've experienced this recently very vividly, someone who's optimistic and hopeful believes that he will be around in the next 10 years, right? I always say 10 years because there's something about that particular time period to the mind that causes it to automatically see it as long term. When in reality, it's actually not that much. But anyways, when you're able to say, or when you're able to believe that you will be around in 10 years, then the perception that you have of what is possible changes from actively conceiving, right? So not just, you know how the mental body is, you're actively looking for the shortest path if you want, right? Like in computer science bros here, shortest path algorithm, right? What is the quickest way to get to B, right? You're switching from that to, it's almost like a letting go of active management in place of, for lack of better words, dynamic management. Meaning, it's like you know what you want, and you know that while you constantly believe that what you want is possible, the actions that are necessary to essentially cause what you want to occur will pop up at fortune moments, at like key moments, right? What video editors could say called keyframes. I've actually talked about this before. I think in Cultivating Your Life Force, Cultivating Your Spiritual Gifts. I think when I went in on like how some people give up too easily, right? But I'm saying it's like the belief that what you want is possible fuels it. If it like it's like a force in itself that takes on like a multi-dimensional like aspect. It's almost like summoning an entity from the beyond, and it moves you almost like if you ever seen those, is it dragger cars where like the car it's going so fast that like it deploys a parachute and the parachute slows it down, right? This is in the opposite, meaning the parachute is actually pulling you forward, right? And what this looks like is it's almost like you can't put your finger on it, but you feel as if there is something at work in your favor that is actively guiding you to where you want to go. And you'll experience this in like weird, like what people call like synchronicities. Like you'll see like a word or something that you were just thinking about, and you'll be like, holy shit, right? Or you'll see like the same number sequence over and over, right? Like, this is actually like repertory. It's like particular sequence numbers. Some believe actually have like actual meanings to it, right? Or you'll see like recurring motifs and patterns or themes over and over, right? Not like in like a bad way, but in like a signpost, hey, you're doing the right thing, keep believing kind of way, right? And all of these will essentially be a manifestation of your unconscious. Sure. Spare me. Yeah, your unconscious mind is, it will be a manifestation of your unconscious mind at work, right? What some people have referred to as the superego, but actually mistakenly in the past called the id, or yeah, actually the id. Sorry, yeah, because people say that like your identity defines who you are, and who you or what you believe about who you are defines your actions, and essentially predetermines your fate. Right? That's kind of like the verbiage, right? But if you rewind what I just said and unpack it, you'll understand that that's something else. But essentially, this is your unconscious manifesting itself to you, right? And it's essentially why most of the time um, you have to be. It's like you have to be in this state of. It's like you have to be like believing 100% that what you want is possible. That's the only way for you to actually be in a state of mind that is open enough to see the manifestation of the unconscious. Without that, like, it's literally impossible. It could literally be screaming at you in the face to where it's blue and you wouldn't even be able to perceive it, right? Um, this is also another reason, or the explanation behind why people believe your dream, what people call the dream state, or the state of mind that you're in when you're dreaming, is when the unconscious is most in operation, right? Because you want to think of it, and this is why I kind of I get it a little heady here, and it gets a bit harder because it almost sounds like what I'm talking about is the mental mind, but it's not, because this is actually the gateway of your higher senses, your higher cognitive functions, where people have like called like there's like clairvoyance, like premonition, fortune telling. What's another one? Just telekinesis. Just like basically direct manipulation of uh, the raw essence that comprise the elements known as reality itself, right? Or it's like direct, deep level or transcendental / mystical level insight into the raw elements, or the raw elements that comprise what we know as reality, right? Because it's not just logic or reasoning anymore. It's way beyond that. It's like you're tapping into something else, right? And that's why people they use the word soul, and I prefer the word imagination because um, when you think about what happens when you're using your imagination, um, you start to realize that it's actually not necessarily you, right? Like when you think of um, like it's one thing to say, okay, I want this, and you start thinking about the things that need to occur for that to happen, right? So the mental mind. But it's another to literally sit there and be like, what is possible, right? Like that's the query. And then when the query comes back, just think about just what needs to occur. Like, how is that conceived? The conception of something that is possible, right? First, that means that it has to be unique. Then that means on some level it has to be like authentic to you, right? Like it can't just be some shit that like I don't know. It can't just be something that's like not resonant with who you are, right? On some level. Um, or another way of putting it, it can't be something that's not beneficial to you. I think that's the better way of putting it, right? Like it's not leveling you up in one way. Maybe bringing you experience, life level IQ, insight, etc. Right? And then third, what I call the formulation of it, or um, how it ultimately uh, takes physical composition, right? Like, for example, a bottle has this shape, right? So this is, right, overall. If you think about it at the end of the day, this is its composition. It has that shape, right? The remote, it has that shape, right? I don't know. Fucking perfume, right, has this shape. Now, for something to be imaginated, it has to have like its own shape, right? If I can get into like geometrical magic and all this shit, I don't even know. But like you start when you start thinking about that, just unraveling it, what it means to imagine something, you start realizing that on some level it literally has to be as if given by God, right? Because for something like, for example, like fucking um, Michelangelo's Pretty Young Man, right? You've seen that shit, right? Like, for him to just sit there and be like, dude, I'm gonna draw this guy, but like, he just got there and started drawing. It's like, bro, what if I did that, right? Just the unraveling of the sequence of events that compelled him to move his hands at those particular points. It almost, like, there's no other way for that to have come into being unless it being almost inspired by something else, right? And so I think, in my opinion, that's why that multi-dimensional visual representation of like you leaving your body is used so commonly, because on some level you have to like be emptied of self, of who you are, and maybe like God or something inhabitates you, or comes into you and fills you, like some spirit fills you and almost takes the role of muse for that moment in time, compelling you to put forth something that you never even thought to put out, right? Or you never even um, um, decided was either worth important or worth or important, worth important enough to put out, or even um, necessary on some level, right? Like sometimes, like when you're writing something, you're making a video, and you're using imagination. Like most of, at least for me, like some of the ideas that I come up with, at first I'm like, what the fuck? Like, what's the point of this? But then as I'm like going to my keyboard and writing down on my to-do list the idea for the video, its importance has the words that come out or that come to mind that describe the title, for example. As those words pop up, they only reveal its um, the magnitude of importance of that video or particular creation or piece of work. And I feel like it was probably the same for him, and it's probably the same for everyone else. And for that to occur, you have to be mused by something else, right? I always say something divine, higher than yourself, at least. Um, and to me, that's like the basis of, I guess, astral travel, if you will, right? So if you were to make a multi-dimensional representation of your astral body, I would literally draw it as a fucking spaceship. Or to get really simple, fucking swag simple with it, triangle like this, triangle like that, right? But I think the sign of, you guessed it, Merkaba. I think that's what it is. Yeah, that's literally how we draw it, because it's like when you're using your imagination, anything is possible. And you're more driven by the need for something favorable to occur. That tends to typically be something good for all, right? And because of that pure intention, you're propelled to, for lack of better words, heights that were not cognized or foreseen before, right? So, I don't know, let's try to make this more concrete. It's the seed of the imagination, right? To imagine, you have to be able to believe in the future, but not just believe in the future, believe that you will be around in the future. So that means that imagination is tied to optimism on some level. And so that means that to be imaginative on some level is to be filled with grace, right? Not to sound cheesy or anything, but that's essentially the gist of it. I mean, I know a lot of people are creative, and because of maybe their negativity, for lack of a better word, it only goes to a certain level. Like, I think you can all relate to the term like dead art, right? Like, it doesn't make you feel anything, right? It looks nice, but there's nothing that moves you. But truly, creative work moves you because bolstered by the imagination, the work is done in a way that you're moved to a higher level, right? And that is the very basis of why that art is so good, right? Or that is the very basis of why that art is so creative. If you think about it, anything you've always called creative has that quality to it, like that spiritual quality. It's like, it doesn't just look good, but there's something about it, right? That's the fucking key term. So to create something that makes you feel that itch, like you can't put your finger on it. There has to be something beyond you that's at work, right? And this is the unconscious mind, right? Just that part of you that cannot be accessed. It's like fucking the part of the the reserve section of your stack, if you will. So, for you, or for you to have the opportunity to see that at work, you have to be essentially almost beyond yourself, or you almost have to like put yourself aside and then realize its magnificence in the way that it's revealing itself to you, right? So you start noticing, paying attention to like the small things. Like some people say, you gotta see something, right? Now, going back, again, this is all tied to the belief that you will be around in the next 10 years, and then the next 10 years will be good to you. It's almost like it unlocks you to just access all your faculties, and then also be confident enough to want to put something out that is not only desirable to others, in the sense that like did partake or enjoy in the experience of whatever it is, but then also it is almost enriching in one way or the other. And again, that's all tied to that state of grace. That was a doozy. And that's just occurring and behind the scenes almost. Obviously, again, I mentioned when you're dreaming, that's when it's also occurring, right? Because when you're dreaming, you're not actively managing everything that's going on. You're literally forced to just let everything unfold, right? And that's why dreams are so, I guess, powerful, game-changing even, right? Because you just don't know what's going to happen, but the dream is unfolding and you're experiencing and you're trying to make sense of it. And it's only after the fact that you realize the true essence of the dream, which was maybe to show you something that you could not see because you were constantly just actively imagining things. Don't want to go overboard, but I think I'll just end it there. So that's kind of why I used the spaceship example image. So now, how to optimize. Obviously, so it's kind of funny, but drawing actually, right? So the act of drawing forces you to connect not only with your mental mind, but also with your imagination. Because you can draw, right? You can logically tell yourself to draw a square, or draw a circle, or even like copy something. But the moment, the drawings where you use your imagination is when you almost don't really care how you're not actively managing the geometric composition of the drawing itself. You're more focused on essentially the energy behind the drawing, and then as such, you're letting it draw itself, so to speak. And that's how you create space for that higher level, I guess, spirit, entity, whatever, divine, to essentially come in and muse you into pulling some swaggy ass shit. Right. So drawing is a really amazing way of cultivating your body, cultivating your astral body. Another way also is just listening to music, right? Because music, on some levels, obviously, it accesses different frequencies, right? Like, even just if the length of time of like a extremely resonant frequency is short, right? Maybe it's just like literally like 2 or 3 milliseconds in like a melody. Your ear captures that, right? And I'm actually putting a blurb on this in my notes, but it's like that the fact that it's like a bit is what matters, right? The fact that it's like you actually capture that value, that moment in time is what matters, and that exposure to that tone, that frequency is what matters. And so by allowing yourself to experience something like that in a way that you cannot control, right? Like you don't know when it's coming, you don't know how long it's going to be. You just know that something amazing happened the moment you hear it. It almost forces you to let go, which is the genesis or the beginning point of what you would be doing if you were to try to exercise imagination, right? So it's kind of funny how drawing and listening to music tend to go hand in hand almost, right? And then another one is, I had this in mind, God, can't believe, I was going to say photography, right? So I don't want to be generic, like anything using artistic, but I think it's things that are really more focused on the ear and the sight senses, right? So freestyling based activities that only use the ears or the eyes. I just realized that's like could be a myriad of things, but I'll just let it run there. Chemical way. Get real fucked up. No, I'm just kidding. Let's see. The component in DMT is dimethyl tryptamine, right? Which here is, I hear methyl tryptamine, I hear tryptamine. Every time I hear tamine, I hear amine, so nitrogen, right? So anything nitrogen based will probably assist in that. So this is proteins, right? So meats, I think I may actually just have to focus back on eggs. So eating a lot of eggs. For some reason, drinking tea will help. There's something. Beef jerky. There you go. Eating beef jerky will help increase your imagination. How do I explain this? Well, just think about what you would be doing if you were eating dried or meat that you had essentially cooked a few days ago and put away in your pouch, right? In like caveman days. Most likely it'd be either when you're starving or you show up somewhere. Again, going back to the whole fourth moon thing. Well, there didn't show up today, but you still have some storage. So you take it out of your pouch and you start slowly malaxing it between your teeth, right? Because it's hard and brittle. hence the term molasses, which is chewing gum, right? So you sit there and you're thinking, and you start wondering, imagining what it'd be like if you always had an abundance of food, and then you start wondering, why is it the only kind of food source that I would eat? And so you start imagining, oh, well, plants. I saw this plant. One day it was like this. Next day it was one day it was like this. Next day it was like this. Now it's like this. Okay, so that means there's a growth process, and you start envisioning planting fruits, right? So that sounded very elaborate, but there's something to a food that is not exactly tender, but that causes you, again, as I said, mole, I think is the word, mole over, right? Sugar cane, right? Just things that will just facilitate that pensive activity. I don't know why, but I feel really strong about that beef jerky. Obviously, running is a huge one. Every time I run, I have like fucking a shit ton of ideas when I come back. And the reason why, obviously, as you're running, maybe you have music, all of a sudden you hit runner's high, and then you start just daydreaming, right? So that's what you're trying to. You're trying to encourage daydreaming. That. Just think about what that entails. I think that was everything I had to say about this body. On to the last one, and this is the Aetheric Bodii. And now this is where I get even more esoteric, because a lot of people, when they talk about, for example, the etheric plane, at some point or the other, they mention this thing called the Akashic Records, right? And not to get really esoteric or like just really meta, but it's believed to be essentially this metaphysical place where everything that was and ever will be, that was, is, and ever will be, is recorded and essentially cataloged. So all information on all things can be found at the Akashic Records, right? And it's awesome, right? And then also, most likely you'll hear of like the etheric plane and how like that's essentially, if you want, for lack of better words, like the nexus of all realities. Meaning, that's when you run into entities, like multidimensional entities of all kinds, right? At different frequencies. So maybe like nefarious ones, helpful ones, right? Like malicious ones, etc., etc., right? And then at the same time, it's also when you see them, you see all different compositions, right? So all physical manifestations, right? Some of them, like physical manifestation might resemble something human-like, some is like spirit, ghosts, like blah blah blah, right? And that's where that whole myriad from like ghosts to phantoms to like imps, right? Mixed shit. Anyone's trying to like Superman, that shit. So where it all comes from, right? What I would say is that to make it more simple. Okay, so we're all alive, right? By virtue of being alive, we're essentially all one energy, right? And by virtue of being part of that all one energy, remember, the sum of the parts equals the whole. This means that we're always able to cognize anything that is, we're always able to cognize whatever it is that we want. What do I mean by cognize? You can think of it as, it's not exactly knowing. It's not like, hey, I want to know what this is, and then there's like an answer that comes into mind, right? But imagine that that's possible. Like if you could ask yourself, what is the sun, right? And then an answer would come from beyond. And the answer would come from the fact that, like, by virtue of being made from one energy, right? From, I guess you want to call it the source, whatever. By virtue of all coming from that same place, you're able to essentially find a way to reference and come into relation with the sun or whatever object of your query, right? So, to put it another way, it's like we're all like, it's all like one life, right? We're all part of like, it's like the same giant one family, right? And because we're all from the same one family, everything that is in this family can be related to, right? Same idea behind essentially why I think I talked about this in like, it's like, I don't know if it was, what was it? There was a video in this series where I essentially said that by virtue of being human, you essentially have the ability to see yourself in the other, right? And then I essentially made the point that that's essentially the gateway or the start of cultivating empathy, right? Because empathy is the ability to feel what the other person is feeling. But to do that, you have to, on some level, become that person, right? So to become that person, you have to essentially see yourself in that person, meaning you almost see how the way that person is, their actions, whatever, is almost like, on some level, a degree, maybe a greater degree or a smaller degree of some of the actions that you yourself have done in the past, right? So, for example, maybe you like bickered a bit with your sisters, right? Or you bickered a bit with your girlfriend. And then, like, you see a wife beater and you realize that, wow, like, he is actually just a greater degree of my bickering, right? Because it's just like that amplified, I guess, tense or anger or whatever energy. It's just amplified and it results in those dramatic actions, right? And that same way is of seeing or relating or empathizing can be applied to anyone, right? And so I think I talked about how, like, it's because of that, like, that we should essentially always strive to be compassionate to all people, because at the end of the day, that was you at some point, right? And you just never know what someone's going through. And to kind of bring it back to this, the fact that we all come from that same place, the fact that we are all born, like, just think about that for a second. Everything that exists has to be born. And just that little, subtle, yet ridiculously important fact makes it to where anything is relatable. That essentially gives us the ability of relation, right? Him to me. And so, on some level, I believe that the etheric body is the thing that makes us all relatable to one another, right? And I wouldn't necessarily call it the soul. I'd actually, not to sound cheesy or even nerdy, I'd use the word the fucking all spark. Because if you think about it, like, the all spark is what makes someone alive, right? All things alive contain the all spark within them. If you want to use, uh, like, um, yeah, all things alive contain the all spark within them, the pulse of life. So when people get really, uh, they get really poetic with it, right? The they, for example, there's this thing. It's not like it's like the fractal of life or something. And it's just a really cool thing where um, it's almost like it looks like someone took a picture of that pulse and blew it up on a multi-dimensional axis, and you just see like maybe that's life, right? So everything that is alive contains that, and by virtue of that, everything that is alive is relatable. And I believe that that is what the etheric body at the end is. And I know people like to say it's like right at the center, right? That's why Jesus pointed at his heart, right? Or others like to say that it's this higher level crown theme of God, and that is, it's like so divine that if it goes away, then that person is dead. And everyone just gets really particular in their expression of it, but I feel like at the end, it's the same, right? Same thing like people use a soul, right? I mean, you have a soul, you're dead, right? I don't know. See, you can see it how you like, but I don't know. I choose to use the word all spark because I feel like at the end of the day, at its root essence, that's what it is. Like literally, like I literally just said that. Like the heart beats because of a pulse, right? And it's the same thing with 100% of everything, like all living creatures, whether it's a dog, right? Like a bird, a reptile, fucking snake, even anything, right? Fucking dragon, lynx, like all creatures. So humans, even, right? Even fucking robots. Like it's literally, there's this all spark, and it's this thing that causes a pulse, causes heartbeat, causes vibration, causes life, right? And so because we all share that, that is what makes us all one, essentially. And how do you cultivate your all spark? I think this is where the old adage, gratitude is the currency of the universe, comes into play. Because, and I say this because something I actually recently vividly experienced. When you lose the will to live, it's almost like, it's not so much that you take granted, you take for granted what you have, but you're so engulfed in the thing that is causing depression or anxiety, right? Your body is so engulfed in serotonin and just so many sectors shut down if you are not activated. You're so engulfed in just that non-motion that it's almost like a pit, right? A sand pit. And essentially what happens is as time goes and the longer you're stuck in there, the more and more it becomes easier to essentially rationalize killing yourself or just rationalize self-destructing, self-sabotaging, um, rationalizing giving up on whatever it is you're pursuing, right? Not because you're not grateful or you're taking things for granted, but because the idea of um, not existing becomes more appealing. And if you think about it, I think that's what death is, right? It's like the appeal to not exist takes over, right? Say, for example, that the soul spark is comprised of a ratio of the will to live to the will to not exist, right? And people oscillate between that. And funny enough, as I mentioned, these bodies go from low to bottom to top, right? So what happens at like the higher bodies affect the lower bodies way more dramatically than what happens. So like the higher bodies affect the lower bodies more than the lower bodies affect the higher bodies, right? So for example, literally in what I just said, you can see the dramatic repercussions, right? When, for example, the will to live overwhelms the will to no longer exist, right? You feel imaginative, right? Which means that most likely you feel, getting into motion is very easy, right? You don't feel so much friction to it, right? So it's easy. Dopamine to be the release of dopamine, which causes activation throughout the body, which causes good feelings, which causes essentially um, the um, the ability to accurately and appropriately reason and use logic to achieve your goals, right? So you can reasonably see that something is possible based on if these sequence of events occur, right? And you can see that something is not if these sequences, right? So it's very easy to just project, right? And then on top of that, your physical body, right? Like you're just it's easy for you to take care of what needs to be taken care of, to eat well. It's easy for you to work out. It's easy for you to drink, eat fruits because you actually enjoy your body. You actually the will to live is overwhelming, so you want to do everything to cultivate that, right? And you want to ensure that you're living at optimum levels, right? So it's easy for you to do things like eating fruits, getting in your minerals, eating good foods that provide your body with the minerals that it needs, provides B12, and going out, getting sunlight in, all this stuff, working out, right? It's very easy to do it when the will to live is overwhelmingly strong, right? But then when simultaneously when the will to not exist is overwhelmingly strong, it's very easy to not be very imaginative or to not see yourself being around in 10 years, right? It's which essentially kills your belief that in 10 years something you would be in a good place, which essentially makes it very likely that your boons, right, like the release of serotonin is more prevalent than dopamine, which means that there's not many sectors or parts of bones that are activated, right, which means that it's very likely for you to um, be illogical or be reasonable, right? Instead of keeping things simple, you see complexities, or you make things really, really hard for no reason, right? Almost like fueled by um, the hardness of it, like the fact that it's hard. Almost, you almost get off on that, and so it like fuels you to make things even harder, which conversely, simultaneously, um, results in an even greater desire to no longer exist because everything is hard, right? Going back to the post I made on like how everything is a circle, right? A cycle, right? When someone gives you good energy, you want to kind of keep that cycle going. When someone gives you negative energy, it's almost like you have choices, right? To either give that energy back or um, negate that by giving positive energy. And so when the will to no longer exist is overwhelmingly strong, it's very easy to be negative, right? To be illogical, to not see that what you want is actually possible, or to come up with things that do not come up with a plan that do not map to it, right? And then again, at the end, it makes it hard to actually keep up with your physical body. It makes it hard to actually see the need to take in food that strengthen those minerals and vitamins, or go out and get sunlight, because you don't see the need to do all of this since you don't even want to exist anymore, right? So it's crazy how all of that literally just feeds on itself, and just how fucking streamlined the bodies are, right? And essentially why I made this video, because I don't know, I felt like a lot of times people talk about them, but they don't go in length in how maybe they're tied into one another, or even further, what it means to you and what you can do about it, right? For example, I think a lot of times the source of most mental illness comes from a sick or unkept or an uncultivated emotional body, right? Emotional slash auric, right? And it's clear, right? Just more serotonin, less dopamine, right? So, right, depressed. Remember the spectrum of what we say a ratio of good feeling, bad feeling is. And so then because you're depressed, it's hard for you to come up with a simple plan, for example, to clean your room or to pass your class, right? And then that feeds into being hard to just get in a workout knowing damn well that you should, or to eat well and cut down on the sugar because you might be predisposed to like diabetes, or you have a huge gut, right? Or even something as simple as like just drinking water, because you know that it'll prevent you from having like a stroke or some sort of weird like anemia related issue, right? Or weird inflammations, right? It just, and so because of that, it's like there's almost this cycle where because you know that, or because you fail to do those things, it almost reinforces an even more negative or an even more uncultivated emotional body, because now you're even less in motion, which results in more serotonin, which means even less parts or sectors of the body, or remember, bones, are activated, which results in, again, going back down, like an even less potent or effective mental body, which leads to an even less need or desire to cultivate the physical body. And so that's when like onsets of like just weird, I don't want to say rationalizations, but just non-empowering viewpoints or perspectives of reality come about, where like it literally becomes like a war between you and yourself, right? And that whole like no house can stand divided against itself comes into play. So you literally just start attacking yourself, and then it just feeds into that even more, and you just slowly just decay. So I think that's where the source of a lot of, I guess, mental issues stem from, right? Like if people could be shown or put on like a plan, a diet for positive feelings, it would set them on the way to essentially help take care of like the lower bodies, and that could essentially set them up to maybe not only reach or think about maybe suddenly or by accident accessing the higher bodies, but then completely changing their lives, right? Yes, it's been a thought I've been having. Holy fucking shit, I just talked for 2 hours and I didn't even realize it. If you watched all this, you my brother. God bless you, my brother. This was a fucking mouthful. Anyways, hope you guys got something out of this. And as always, swag fuck out.